During the next week, I have my 85th birthday, so I think that justifies my putting on the reading glasses here. When you all reach 85, you will understand what I'm talking about. There is one thing that it goes through all of these presidents that I've done as to what it is about a person that makes us choose him to be our president. And it is popular appeal. Give that some thought. It's popular appeal. All the presidents that we have chosen to put in the White House were popular appeal presidents. Some of them, 5 of them, were elected after the previous defeats. They ran for office and didn't make it, and they tried again later and ended up with it. 1840, the year 1840, is when everything changed as far as our nominating presidents go. Then, up until that time, they were nominated in Washington. And there was popular votes at the time, but they didn't carry near the weight they did after 1840. I want you to go with me back, and this is vivid in my memory, to February the 22nd, 1932. That was 75 years ago. But I often think of that day, February the 22nd, 1932. I was in the 2nd grade in school that day, and I remember that day just as if it were yesterday. I remember everything that happened that day. I'll go on and tell you why, maybe I can tell you why. But about 10 o'clock in the morning, it started getting dark. By 12 o'clock lunchtime, you could not see how to read a newspaper in your hand. It had gotten so dark. About 2 hours later, we had a tremendous thunderstorm, and that cleared everything out. But there was more to it than that. That was the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birthday. That was the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birthday, who was our first president. I don't know that there's any significance there, but I do know what happened to me, and I do know that I remember it, and I do know it was the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birthday. The way our presidents are sent to Washington is we elect them for 4 years. And then at the end of that 4 years, they're either re-elected or rejected. And 11 of them to date have been rejected. They did not serve more than just the one term. Several of the ones that were elected that served 8 years returned to Congress. Thomas Jefferson has probably described the office of the presidency as well as anyone. He said, "It's splendid misery." That is the office of the President of the United States as defined by Thomas Jefferson. I did all of these paintings, as we will later go upstairs, and I will talk about the individual paintings and why I did certain things, why I put this guy's jacket on him, why I didn't put a jacket on this guy. There are reasons for it. And the reasons started back we used to get in the mail every year a calendar from the funeral home. And it showed all the presidents of the United States They were all dressed alike. They all had an oval in little ovals. They all had maroon ties, and they all had blue suits on. And I cannot think of a more diverse group of individuals than the presidents of the United States. I have referred to them up until that time as little men in oval frames. I guess that's right. But I worked on this for 3 years. I worked on this project. And I worked 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I held a regular job. But I would work till 3 o'clock, go back in the house. I did all of these in an old restored farmhouse that I had in the woods behind my house. And then I would go back to bed and get up at 7 o'clock like everyone else did and go to school and not give it a second thought. And on the presidents, I was not content just to do the president. I wanted to find out something about that president. I wanted to find out about the individual. And I read anywhere from 6 to 8 books on each president before I did them. And incidentally, when you get upstairs, you'll see this, as you mentioned earlier. These are interpretive portraits. These are my definitions. These are my portraits. I did these portraits without any response from anyone else, the way that I thought they should be done. You may disagree with me, and I'm sure you will, on a lot of them. But we've got to remember that Abraham Lincoln was the first president that we ever had where photography came into effect. Up until the time of Abraham Lincoln, it was all artwork. It was all drawings that Gilbert Stuart and some other artists had made of the paintings up until the time of Abraham Lincoln. But Abraham Lincoln was the first to be presented. And I turned up many interesting facts as I was going through all this, as you can imagine. And I didn't remember any of them. I only remembered one. The third and the fifth president of the United States died the same day. They passed away on July the 4th, 1826. But that was the only factor that I remember. And I gave these to Clemson University and the Strom Thurmond Institute in 1985. So they have been here about 24 years. And I have added presidents as they were elected to those as I interpreted. Again, these are my interpretations as I interpreted these presidents through the life of Senator Thurmond. And Senator Strom Thurmond died 2 or 3 years ago, and so I have quit doing the portraits. Before we go upstairs to look at the portraits, I'd like to talk a little bit about the presidency and a little bit about the presidents themselves. George Washington was one that should be remembered. He was our first president, of course, and I've painted him in the Virginia militia uniform. I didn't paint him in the finished uniform because he had a dental problem. And later in life, any portrait he had done, someone had packed his gums and his cheeks full of cotton and had made his face round, whereas it was not that way. When Gilbert Stuart did more portraits of Washington than anyone. When he got ready to go to Europe, he would say, well, let's do another portrait, General Washington. So he would do a portrait of Washington, but he would pack Washington's face with this cotton and would paint it that way. I painted George Washington a little earlier. There's a display at the Masonic Museum It's open to the public in Alexandria, Virginia, that has got some of Washington's teeth in it, and it's worth the trip to see. Some of the teeth were unbelievable, but they were actually teeth that George Washington had at the time he was president. Another one that I think we need to mention is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was quite a president. He was our number 3 president. Number 2 was John Adams. But Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Now let's remember that. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he was the founder and the first rector of University of Virginia, which is a startling fact. And he retired and died at Monticello, which is on the campus or is near University of Virginia. For a long time, I did not do Andrew Jackson because I wanted to use a piece of hickory wood and kind of half carve it and half paint it. He was a radical, believe me, a radical rebel general. He didn't get along with Washington. His men called him Old Hickory. That's where he got the nickname Old Hickory. He was handling our victory in New Orleans, which we can give him credit for. He bought the state of Florida from the Spanish for $5 million. He was the first governor of Florida. And he did a lot of other things that I won't mention, but he was of such character and such caliber that I thought to do a hand carving of him would be better than doing an ordinary portrait. He died in his home, the Hermitage in Virginia. Number 16 was Abraham Lincoln. I know you have all heard a lot about Abraham Lincoln. I read many books on him, and I will say this: he probably had the highest moral character of any person I've ever known. He repaid every debt he ever owed. He was a tall man, and I did him with a tall hat on. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall. And for you Republicans, he founded the Republican Party, believe it or not. But I guess the single most important thing he did was he found General Ulysses Grant. Grant was one of his generals in the West, as it was called at the time, and Lincoln discovered him and decided to bring him over in charge of the Union forces in the Confederate War, and they ended up winning the Confederate War. And it's because of Lincoln's insight into picking up and bringing Ulysses Grant into the picture. And of course, it was sad. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, which we are, and he was succeeded by Andrew Johnson, who was no Harry Truman, but we managed to live through it. Then we were elected President number 18, Ulysses Grant. He was a great leader. He took over the mess that Johnson had left, and he made a good, strong government out of it. But he was unsuccessful in running for re-election 3 years later, and so he didn't do it. But he died. He ended up being a poor man. Mark Twain, of all people, hired him to write an article for a monthly publication that Mark Twain was putting out. But by the same token, Ulysses Grant wrote a story of his life before he passed away, and left royalties to his wife of $450,000. I'm not going to leave that to my wife. Which reminds me of a story. I was reared in the backwoods in a little country town of North Florida. I'm a Florida cracker. And there's been some discussion about where the word cracker comes from. And I can tell you it's the crack on the end of a whip that the word cracker came from. But I was raised in North Florida. And we had a guy named Charlie Reeves who did some plowing for us. And Charlie could plow better than anybody I've ever seen. But Charlie had a problem. It was his wife. She was on his case all the time. Charlie, why don't you wear a hat? Why do you stay in the sunshine? All that streaks on your face, they'd all go away. And she stayed on his case all the time. So finally, to get away from her, he'd go out at night and plow. And he could be seen out there in the moonlight plowing just to get away from his wife. So one day she brought his lunch to him, a glass of iced tea and the fruit jar. You know how they used to do it. And so they brought it to him, and about halfway through, she started again. You know those purple spots on your face? If you didn't sit here in this sunshine and eat your lunch, they wouldn't be there. Well, the old mule had had enough of it. The old mule kicked up his heels and killed her. Actually killed her. So I went to the funeral, naturally, since Charlie was one of our boys. And after the funeral, I went up. He was sitting on the front row. I went up to him and I says, Charlie, there's something I want you to explain to me. He says, what's that? I says, well, I've noticed the women folks, they come up here and they talk to you and you nod your head like this and then they walk off. Is that right? He says, yes. They're complimenting me on the nice job the funeral home did and the nice attitude I had about her passing away. I said, but I also noticed that when the men come up here, you turn your head like this. I says, what in the world is happening there? He says, I keep trying to tell those men that that old mule is not for sale. That didn't happen. Theodore Roosevelt said his greatest achievement was the Panama Canal. And I've got Theodore Roosevelt, you'll see him when you go upstairs, very small, but very strong. He was a very strong individual. He was an outdoorsman, was a horseman, rough rider in the Spanish-American War, and he was making a campaign speech and was shot in the chest in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I believe it was. He kept right on talking, wouldn't let him do anything for his chest till he finished his speech. And he said that it was more important to complete that speech than it was to get medical attention. But he was defeated in his re-election bid when he ran later for office. Woodrow Wilson is another one that he was our 28th president, was another one that we should give some thought to. I always think of him as I want you for the U.S. Army. I don't know why, but that seems to be it, because that was a popular poster in World War I, and that was when he was so popular. But he was a first-class gentleman. He said that if a man stood back, opened the door, let a lady go through before him, the fact that he was now president meant he was going to do that same thing. And he did. He was a gentleman all the way. He founded the League of Nations, and I've painted him, as you'll notice later, with a black cape on, which he wore frequently, with a red rose. But that was his wearing apparel. Warren Harding was the first one I did, and I did him because he was right in the middle. I took all the presidents at the time I did these, and he was the one right in the middle. So I decided to do one of him and then go each way. Do one of the more contemporary portraits next, and do one of the earlier portraits here. He was a playboy, so I did him with golf clubs, but I won't go into his life later because it was quite interesting. Calhoun Coolidge, as a matter of fact, Warren Harding was on vacation in San Francisco with his wife, and he had pneumonia, and he was getting along very well, and all of a sudden he died. She was reading to him, and he died right there on the bed. Some folks have said that he died of grief. Others have said he died because he got tired of the presidency, but at any rate, he died. At 2 o'clock the next morning, they got hold of Calhoun Coolidge, who was vacationing at the time in Vermont. He was with his daddy, and his daddy was a federal judge. So his daddy swore him in as president. He was the 30th president of the United States, and he was sworn in his kitchen in the state of Vermont. While he was in the White House, his son was playing golf, and his son got a sand spur in his foot, and his son died from that sand spur thorn because we didn't have antibiotics in those days. So those were some of the sad things he had. But the main thing about Calhoun Coolidge was he was president at the time the United States was on the roll. I mean, it was when we were really doing things. It was just before Hoover got in. But Calhoun Coolidge, I did him, you will notice when you go upstairs, in linen. I stretched linen over the canvas I was painting on and used linen instead of the canvas because he wore linen suits a lot. And I've let the raw linen on the painting show through. If you'll observe it closely, you'll see that the raw linen of the suit is there. You can see the linen. And it's because Calhoun Coolidge wore linen suits a lot. Then we come to number 32, who is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In my book, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the man of the last century. I have done a 20-foot mural of him in my lifetime, but with some 40 people in it. But Franklin Roosevelt was the man of the century. Now, I didn't agree and don't agree with all of his liberal thinking, but that was Roosevelt. He brought us through a depression. He brought us through World War II. And the way he did it was he could smile at you and you'd know he was using you, but the way he'd smile at you, you didn't care. It didn't matter. I mean, he was all smiles all the time, but he was conning you. Believe me, he was a con artist, and he was one of the best. And one of the bad things that did happen to him was that a month before Germany surrendered, he died at Warm Springs, Georgia. If you've never been to Warm Springs, it's well worth your effort. I've been I don't know how many times, and I never go in that area that I don't go by Warm Springs. But it was his home away from home, and he spent a lot of time there. The reason he went in the first place was because of polio that he had. And the Warm Springs of Georgia was supposedly helping his polio. We don't know whether it did or not, but he operated under the pretenses he did. He was one of our great presidents. And I've visited Hyde Park New York on several occasions too when I was working on his portrait. And I would recommend that. If you're up in that area anywhere, I would recommend that you go by Hyde Park and see Roosevelt's museum. He was followed by Harry S. Truman. And Harry S. Truman goes down in the history book as one of the greats. He was totally kept in the dark by FDR. He didn't know anything about the atomic bomb. He didn't know anything that was going on in the world really except what he picked up otherwise. But FDR did not tell Harry Truman anything. Some of the things Harry Truman did was the Marshall Plan, which is probably the greatest thing he ever did. The Berlin airlift. He dropped the A-bombs on Japan. And believe me, I was in favor of that and still am today, simply because I had done a tour on B-17s in Europe, and I was in training to go to the South Pacific to do a tour on the B-29s. And because Harry Truman dropped those two bombs on it the way he did, it kept me from going to Japan. So I'm a little narrow on that. He had his problems when he was in office because it was the end of the war. He had some strikes. He had problems with labor. He had the rail strike, the coal strike. He spent a lot of time down in my neck of the woods in Key West. That's where he went. And I guess the greatest thing, the thing he got the most publicity from was beating Truman, was beating who did he beat in 48? Dewey. He beat Dewey in 48. And some of the newspapers had already had articles published. The Chicago Times, for instance, had an article published of where he had won the election and Truman had lost it. But Truman won that, and I guess the greatest thing he's remembered for is that. Another one that I think we should remember is Lyndon Johnson. I guess we all know he was a World War II hero, but I guess the most important thing that he ever did, that John Kennedy did, was he stirred the nation. He got us back on the track. If you will really look at where we were before he came into office and what he did. And the Sputnik thing got under his skin. He said we would have a man on the moon and return him to the United States within the next decade because the Russians had fired the Sputnik. And as we all know, he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon Johnson, I will say that I did the painting of Lyndon Johnson the way he would dress when he drove his Lincoln around the ranch, throwing the beer cans out. But at any rate, he quit doing that, and when he would meet the planes, from then on he would have on a suit when the press got hold of it. But until the press got hold of it, they really ran it in the ground. And the shirt he's got on in the painting is one I found that was from a Sears Roebuck catalog. And I thought it was appropriate to put it on Lyndon Johnson, and I chose to do it. Very briefly, and then I'll sit down and let you go upstairs. I'll talk a little bit about Richard Nixon. And at the time I did Richard Nixon, it was before Watergate. I want you to understand that. And when I went to see Richard Nixon, when I visited him in the White House as his guest, when I was invited to the White House, it was before Watergate, or before Watergate came to the limelight. Nixon had a red highlight in his eyes that I've never seen before or since with anyone, but he had a red highlight in his eyes. Any angle I got to him, he had a red highlight in his eyes. And the next day, at about 10 o'clock, I was back in my office and the phone rang. And the guy said, I'm so-and-so, I don't even remember his name. I'm from Jack Anderson's office. He says, I want you to tell me just how drunk Nixon was yesterday when you talked to him. Of course, I hung the phone up. Two of the great things he did was he broke the ice in China and in Russia. And for a time, I was going to put the Great Wall of China and going to put the Pentagon and, the Russian tomb in that picture. But I forgot, I decided to leave it out. And then Watergate came along, and it changed the whole picture of Nixon. He resigned as the first president to resign from office in the United States. And the question is still to be answered, what kind of president he was. Ronald Reagan, I'll go one more. Ronald Reagan, I was visiting my daughter in Monterey, California, one Christmas Eve, and had the radio on, and it said, this is your announcer. I want you all not to be worried about your governor, who was Ronald Reagan. He was governor of California at the time. He's driven down to visit Jack Benny, who is not expected to live, who's in the hospital in San Francisco, but he'll be all right. The snow is about ended, and it will be gone before he gets back. But I wanted you to know. And that was my first exposure to to Ronald Reagan. And it has changed since then, but not much. Well, it's all yours.
We have the elevator and the stairs to go up. Take a look at the portraits. In your program, you all have the guidebook for it, and we'll be up there, and you can ask questions of Graem about specifics on any of the paintings.
Any questions you have, I'll be happy to try to answer them, okay? But now remember, they're interpretive portraits. Don't forget that. They're interpretive portraits.
They're fun. They're a lot of fun.